what happens with a monogamous relationship, it comes with a set of pre-installed default settings. So you kind of let those default settings do the work for you. If you want to open up your relationship, those default settings no longer serve. They're not there. So you have to do the work. There's no way out of it if you want it to work and succeed and nurture you and thrive.
Welcome to Love Link, your guide to love and sex in all forms. We're your hosts, Simone Humphrey and Sina Simon. Today we welcome relationship coach and non-monogamy expert Effy Blue. After a personal history of failed monogamy and serial infidelity, Effy discovered satisfaction and happiness through polyamory. From her own experiences, along with extensive research, she has built up a wealth of knowledge and the tools to cultivate successful, unconventional relationships. Now, she has a full-time practice in New York City that includes coaching and workshops to help couples and individuals who are interested in transitioning to ethical non-monogamy. So welcome to the Love Link podcast, Effy Blue. So nice to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thanks for coming.
So tell us how you became interested in non-monogamy.
For sure. I got interested in non-monogamy through my own personal journey. I sucked at relationships for a long time. I have a history of serial infidelity. So I was in multiple relationships in which I cheated. I'm not proud of it, but I did cheat. And the interesting part of it was that it wasn't that I would cheat and hide and I was happy about it. I would cheat when I was the happiest. So I wouldn't cheat when I was unhappy and I didn't want the relationship anymore. I would go and cheat somewhere else. I would actually start to explore the idea of dating other people when I was the happiest. Like I would feel settled into a relationship, feel really connected, making future plans. And in that kind of a peak stage, I would be like, oh, I want to explore, I'm interested in this one person. And it was never that I didn't want the person that I was with. I just wanted other explorations, other experiences as well. And then I would go and follow my desires and eventually come back and confess. It just didn't sit right with me. I didn't want to lie. I didn't like I didn't like being out of integrity. It didn't sit well with me. I felt like it wasn't fair on my partners because I did love them. Like it wasn't like I was dismissive of them. I didn't like them and I was just keeping them around. I was very much in love and cared for the relationships. So I would come home and confess and it would never ended well. Tears all around. Eventually these relationships would end. I would say I'm never going to do that again, but it would rinse and repeat. And at some point I was like, this is not working out. I don't want to hurt anybody anymore. I concluded that I sucked at relationships. And then I put everything on hold and poured myself into another career, my previous career in the corporate world. I did that for a decade. I did really well. I rushed up that ladder. I didn't have to worry about relationships. I worked around the world, and which worked really well for my bank account, but not so great for my heart. And eventually my work brought me to New York, and universe aligned, and a bunch of things happened at the same time. I stumbled into the non-monogamous community in New York City while my career was no longer satisfying to me, and I was looking at like what else I could be interested in. And I've met the non-monogamous community. I sort of just stumbled into it, and immediately a light bulb went off. I was like, oh, okay, so it wasn't me. I don't suck at relationships. I just suck at a specific type of relationship. And here's a bunch of people doing relationships differently, and this is appealing to me. And it looks a lot like what I was trying to make happen, but just not well.
It clicked.
Say again?
I said it clicked.
Exactly. I was just like, this is it. I want to learn about this. And then I'm naturally nerdy. I like to study things. I like rabbit holes. And I fell in a big, long rabbit hole of, okay, I want to understand this. And I did this in multiple ways. I did the reading, the studying, the very nerdy stuff. I also was interested in people's experiences. So I just had a million conversations with a million people. Anybody who would talk to me, I had a million questions. And people were very nice and answered my questions. And the third thing was I wanted to know what it felt like to actually do it in a way that was not cheating. And there were things that I was interested in. I knew that I could be in a relationship with somebody and date other people. I knew that I could love more than one person and show up for more than one relationship. What I didn't know is, what would it be like to be the other person, right? Could I date somebody who's dating somebody else, right? What would that feel like? So I kind of went into relationships a little bit experimental. What would it be like to date somebody who's already in potentially a primary relationship? What would it be like dating somebody who identifies as solo poly? So they're dating multiple people, so I'm not the only one. So I went and did a lot of experimental dating and experimental relationships.
And what did you notice as you were starting this process in yourself?
For sure, that it made sense. That it made a lot of sense. All the things that I just had a bunch of question marks about were suddenly cleared. And I realized that you hear, when people talk about polyamory, right? Poly, many loves, right? So people talk about this capacity for love, and that they give examples. For example, they say things like, parents who have two kids are able to love those two kids differently, but the same, right? So we know that the human is capable of loving more than one people at a time. We just, for some reason, put a limit on it when it's a romantic relationship, right? And it became very obvious to me early on that it applies in romantic relationships also. And that was one of the things I was like, oh, I can't really just love more than one person, and I can feel loved by people who also love other people, right? Because sometimes that's where people get stuck, right? They feel like, oh, maybe they can love more than one people. They don't feel loved because they don't feel special if there's more than one person, right? So
how did you grapple with that?
It just made sense to me. Mm-hmm. It's interesting because I'm also an only child. So that's kind of interesting to me because I don't have a sibling, right? So the example works in theory, but I don't have personal experience. And I thought that would have been a barrier, right? Because I didn't have to share attention. In fact, I had double the attention, right? But it actually just made a lot of sense. And I felt seeing my partner love somebody else and then love me just made me realize there was just literally more love, around. And it didn't, I think jealousy comes up. For me, I'm not naturally very jealous. Just dispositionally, I'm not very jealous. Situationally, it just comes up in when I don't feel my needs are being met, right? But I was very clear that it was nothing to do with love. Like, it was just like something is wrong in the moment, and I don't necessarily feel not loved. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And it was just breaking those things up and going into it very consciously, very sort of like, I want to learn from these experiences. There was a lot to learn, yeah.
And it seems like you learned so much and really took that and now are translating it into working with couples who are interested in opening up their relationship.
For sure, yeah. I mean, there's just so much to learn. And what I was doing as I was doing my research, I was realizing there weren't that many resources out there. There are a handful of great books. And there are some therapists who may not pathologize it, but they still don't know much about it. A lot of the relationship material out there is for a couple, for a dyad, for two people. Even communication exercises are always for two people, So there isn't that much out there. And by the time I accumulated all that stuff for myself, I was also passing it on to people who were asking me questions. And at some point I decided what I was doing, my previous career wasn't working for me, and I wanted to change anyway. So I took a 2-year hiatus, sabbatical, I should say, and retrained as much as I could, did all the workshops, all the books, anything that I can get my hands on, and then launched a coaching practice and started working with couples who are interested in exploring this for themselves.
Great. So tell us about non-monogamy. How would you define non-monogamy and also open relationships versus polyamory?
Sure.
And maybe some other things in between.
Yes. So think about it as sort of two headlines, like two umbrella terms. So you have monogamy, essentially two people in a relationship where the key value is fidelity. They don't have sex with anybody else, and therefore they're monogamous. And then there's non-monogamy, where you're in a relationship that is not exclusive. And that's a big umbrella term, and then it looks different in different situations. So polyamory is one version of non-monogamy. Poly, many, amory, loves, many loves, when you're in long-term loving multiple relationships at the same time, and you're sort of nurturing these relationships. And then you can be in an open relationship, so you can you can start off as a couple and open that relationship and start dating other people. And that doesn't always look like polyamory. It doesn't always look like these connected, intertwined, long-term relationships. It could just be short-term dating. It could be very physical or sex-based. And then you can do something Dan Savage coined, which is Monogamish, right? Which is you're monogamous for most of the time, and every now and then you'll go and have a fling, either separately or together. There's also people who do it who are swingers, right? So they're couples who are, mostly sort of monogamous, other than having sex with other couples who are also swinging, and that can be a little transactional, but essentially you're just, as a couple, you're dating other couples who are also dating couples, and there's no sort of dating on your own that happens. And then many other, versions of that, whatever that works for you. In my practice, I coach around this idea of relationship by design. I work with people in designing relationships in which they can thrive. And thriving looks different for different people, right? For some people, thriving looks like nesting, right? They're the people that are have these like warm, cozy homes and dinner parties and the place where everybody goes for Thanksgiving, and that's what thriving looks like for them. For other people, thriving looks like adventure and exploration, and those are the people that are running around the world and jumping out of planes, right? For other people, thriving looks like personal development and growth, and they're the people that are doing the workshops and co-reading books together and doing retreats and that kind of stuff, and that's what thriving looks like for them. So we look at what thriving looks like for the people in the relationship, and then we design something around that. Open, closed, monogamy, non-monogamy is just one aspect of that. And it's the one that rises to the surface because that often is the instigator of like, we need a redesign, right? So people don't have the language to say, we need a redesign. They'll say, we want an open relationship. Which is great. It just means that you need something that you don't have, right? The relationship you have isn't serving you right now, and you want it to be open because you think it's going to serve something, which is a great start, right? The question often is, why? What do you want to create? What are you trying to create by having an open relationship? And then we talk about that, and then that informs the rest of the design. And sometimes, though rarely, people will come to me and they'll say, we want an open relationship. We'll go, okay, sure. We go through the process, relationship by design, and we'll come out the other side, and they will decide to remain monogamous, but the relationship looks very different now. Yeah.
So when you ask the question, why have an open relationship, or why do you want an open relationship, what are some good reasons to have an open relationship, and what are some reasons or a polyamorous relationship, and what are some reasons that might not be so great?
Sure. The reasons that are not good, let me start with that one.
Yeah.
If your relationship is failing, it's not going to save your relationship. If you are in a sexless relationship and you're not addressing that, and you're just looking to go out to have sex with other people without addressing those issues, if you have any unaddressed issues, and if you think that open relationships, non-monogamy, polyamory is going to save your relationship, it's not.
So essentially a couple should really be in a stable place.
Yes, absolutely. If your house isn't in order, you don't want to include other people in that. It
doesn't feel safe.
It doesn't feel safe for you or other people. It's just going to exacerbate whatever is going on. It's going to add more moving parts. It's going to add more ambiguity. It's going to add more space that you probably don't want. Not healthy space. So you're going to end up having unhealthy space, and it's just going to erode away at whatever isn't already working.
But I imagine there's probably many couples that come because they're dissatisfied with something, and that's why they want to open it up. So how do you determine when there's just dissatisfaction that will be helped in opening versus they really need to work on this issue before they open it up?
For sure. Dissatisfaction is a given part of any relationship, right? No one's perfect. No relationship is perfect. Dissatisfaction is a part of a relationship. the big difference is if you're addressing it or avoiding it, right? If you've had the conversations or you're willing to have the conversations, so identify what isn't working, where the dissatisfactions are, and then trying to design around it consciously is very different than I'm dissatisfied, I don't want to talk about it, I'm just going to go out and do this other thing.
Right.
Does that make sense? Yeah.
And what if one person wants to open up the relationship, but the other person doesn't?
It happens. Absolutely happens. It depends if people are willing to compromise. I find that the relationship by design process addresses that, because we look at the why often, right? And I think if people understand the individual reasons for one people to open up, and it doesn't feel personal, right? It's not like, I don't want you, I want somebody else. But there is this need that I have, and I want to address that. I still love you. I still care for this relationship. If we really address it, people often can wrap their heads around the other person wanting to be open if they don't want to be open. It just becomes a problem if the person who doesn't want to be open or try polyamory, if they feel like they're not wanted or they're going to feel left out, left behind. If we address those things, often people can wrap their heads around it. Sometimes they can't, and compatibility is a thing. You might just not be compatible, and that is, it sucks, but that might be a thing.
Yeah. And then do you help couples kind of work through ending if that's not the right decision or if it's not the right fit?
Yes. Sometimes you can, I try not to make presumptions or assumptions. You can often tell how it's going to end up. Sometimes people do come to me and they say, I want to open up. And what they mean is, I want to break up. Yeah. And they don't want to have those conversations. And this is their phasing out, And again, that's not why you should, open up your relationship or seek advice in that way. I think if you want to break up, you should handle that. You want to, seek professional help to break up. Absolutely. There's nothing wrong with that. But I think to say you want to open up a relationship because you don't want to say I want to break up, I don't think that's a good way to go about that.
It's definitely not the right reason.
Right.
What about if somebody is in a monogamous relationship and they want to begin the conversation with their partner? Mm-hmm. What advice do you have for doing that?
For sure. I think this is a great question, and it's something that I can't talk about enough, because I see often that first approach determines how the rest of the conversations are going to go. So if you're getting that right, actually is very foundational. That first conversation informs pretty much every other conversation that you're going to have about this, right? And there are definitely some clear do's and don'ts that I like telling people about. There's some do's. Talk about it big picture first. Approaching your partner cold and saying, I'm considering opening up our relationship, or let's open up our relationship, or to talk about open relationships or non-monogamy specifically about your relationship cold is not a good idea. Definitely talk about it as a more big picture stuff. You can refer to an article, you can refer to a podcast, you can refer to this podcast, you can refer to books. At the moment, there's so much conversation around polyamory out there. You're not short for material. Find something. You should be doing your research anyway. That's the next do that I want to share. Do your research. Understand what it means to be in an open relationship. And then refer to those things. I read this article about non-monogamy. I'd love to talk to you about it. Oh, have you heard this podcast? Let's listen to this podcast together and talk about how we feel about it, right? Do your research. Come to it with ideas of the structure rather than applying it straight to the relationship. The next thing is, when you approach your partner about it, also know what you want to create. Also, don't be shy about addressing your concerns about it, right? Don't do a hard sell. Do your research and say, I'm thinking about it. I can see how this would really work for me in these ways. And then there's some things that I think, that would be really hard for me. If you think that it's going to be all rosy and you have no concerns, that means you haven't done your homework and you haven't really thought about it. So when you're talking about it, don't do a hard sell. Talk about it as equally as possible and solicit feelings and thoughts rather than sort of demands and requests. And there's some practical tips. Don't talk about it late at night. Don't bring it. I always tell people, don't bring it up on a weekday past 8 p.m. Because these conversations, you're often tired and they're never going to be short. And what you don't want to do is start a conversation at that time and then go into talking about it until 2 p.m. where people are having like very emotional reactions to it. Do it at the weekends, do it early in the evening, talk big picture stuff. Don't try to solve it in the first conversation. You're never going to solve it in one conversation. This is going to be a beginning of multiple conversations about what it can look like, how people feel about it, if it's something that you want to do at all. So keep the conversations short. Realize you can always have another one. Don't put pressure on them. Have a clear end time. Like if you're still talking about it, going round and round in circles in 2 hours, just stop. Press pause. You can always pick it up another time. So those are like my pro tips on how to do it.
Yeah, get your feet wet before diving into the deep end.
For sure, yeah. And like make it an invitation rather than a request or a demand. Let's learn about this more. Let's go to an event. Let's take a workshop. Let's read some books together. Let's explore this and see if it would work for us. Yeah. You know, rather than I want this from this relationship now. That's never gonna work.
Why does a couple, what would be an interest of entering a polyamorous relationship for a couple?
Sure. For some people, they feel like polyamory is an orientation. You know, for some people, they feel like they just don't know any other way. They are only happy when they have multiple relationships happening, or at least the being open to multiple relationships. So some people feel it's an orientation thing. For other people, they find that they show up differently in relationships in a way that nurtures them. Some people do it because of their sexual orientation. They might be bi or pan, and they want to have both of those experiences. Sometimes people fall in love more than one people, and they want to hold on to it, and they want to have this like micro community of people as a relationship. So there are multiple reasons. The thing that people don't talk about is how, right? We are easy to say communication is important, but very few people talk about like what that looks like, what that sounds like, right? I think it's important to get some communication skills under your belt. Nonviolent communication is a great skill to have. You can look it up. It's a great way to start conversations and have conversations. There are also specific ways of the communication around negotiation, for example, like how do you negotiate things? Conflict resolution is something that's really important skill to have. Again, that's conflict resolution through communication, but it's like getting those skills down. So read some books, go to some workshops, practice. And what tends to happen in polyamorous relationships is that you have to do the talking for it to function, so you get to practice these skills, right? Because what happens with a monogamous relationship, it comes with a set of pre-installed default settings, right? So you kind of let those default settings do the work for you. And people sort of bumble along, they make some assumptions, they use monogamy as like pre-existing structure, and they don't necessarily always do the work around communication or get those skills. If you want to open up your relationship, those default settings no longer serve. They're not there. So you have to do the work. There's no way out of it. If you want it to work and succeed and nurture you and thrive, all those things. So you need to get your communication right, practice it, and then practice it with multiple people. One of the things that I love about polyamory is the feedback you get. Because if you're in a monogamous relationship and your partner's giving you feedback, you can end up in a, your word against their word. So, for example, if your partner's saying to you, oh, you can be critical, you can be like, no, I'm not, right? There's no, that's it. Like they perceive you as critical, you think you're not critical, that's kind of the end of the conversation, or ongoing arguments, right? If you're in a polyamorous relationship and your, two other partners are going, you can be critical sometimes. And you're like, oh.
I guess I am critical.
Yeah, you're like, okay.
Yeah, the group effect.
Right, exactly. You're like, okay, I guess I show up critical sometimes. Let me think about that,
Yeah.
And something about polyamorous relationships, I think, nurtures these conversations. People tend to talk about these things more.
Do you have any communication pro tips? Like just some ones that quick and dirty communication tip?
I'll throw in some tactical stuff that I think is great for any relationship. Some things that I definitely share with my clients. If you're in a relationship, if you're in a conversation and people are starting their sentences with "but," that conversation is officially derailed. Stop. I tell people stop immediately. To even just take a 5-minute pause. If you find yourself someone saying something and the other person's like "but," and they carry on, and the other person goes "but," and carry on, that conversation is not working. You're wasting time and words in that moment. If you catch yourself in that place, just stop, take a pause, and start again. That's just a tactical tip for any communication. The other thing that I really recommend people is "what I've heard you say is a great way to start a conversation. Again, if you're finding yourself not communicating one another, just to stop to repeat what you've heard is really helpful, because communication is tough. What you think is happening in your head and how it's being perceived, it crosses a chasm, and there's often breakdown in that communication. So if you can just start your sentences with "what I've just heard is," or "what I've heard you say is," and repeat back, you'll often realize there's been a communication breakdown, and that works just in any relationship. The other thing that I use a lot in my own relationships, and also in that I teach in my practice, is we talk a lot about we say "I have a story in my head that," and what you're then doing is you're acknowledging that you have an assumption, or you're operating from a certain belief, and what you're not saying is "you're doing this," or "you're angry with me right now." Right?
It's less accusatory.
Right. You're leaving space so the other person can be like, "Oh, okay, that's interesting." The other person can be, there's space for the other person to be curious, not immediately defensive, right? So if you, again, I tell people, if you're about to say you are being a certain way, or you are doing something, see if you can rephrase it and say, "I have a story in my head that this is what's happening," or "you're angry with me," or "you're being dismissive with me," because then you're owning that it is your belief system, and you're leaving space for the other person to meet you in that place, rather than having this this defense come up, this reaction of defensiveness that comes up, which is just very human. If you're accused, you become defensive. That's very human. So how can we leave space for this conversation to be addressed, rather than defenses going up? In terms of polyamorous relationships, making room for conversation is important, especially if you have multiple relationships. You might not always have the space to have conversations. If you only see somebody, twice a week, and you want to use that time for fun and games, or catching up, or whatever you're doing, or date nights, you might find that you don't have space allocated for conversations, for communication of whatever is going on. So scheduling check-ins is a very good poly practice. So once a month, the time that you're going to spend, instead of being a fun date night, you kind of say, "Okay, tonight we're going to sit down, get comfy in our pajamas," or whatever that works for you. Some people, it's actually sitting around the table like this with pen and paper. For some people, it's pajamas and cozy on a couch, and do a very intentional check-in. Again, that actually works for monogamous relationships. But if you're in multiple relationships, it's really important that you schedule that time. Because most of the time what you're doing is scheduling date nights and fun things, and things accumulate because you don't want to have serious conversations when you want to have fun with somebody that you may only see once or twice a week, right? So very intentional check-ins are also really important.
These are such good practical tips.
Yeah, and like you were saying, also for monogamous couples.
Sure.
As well.
Yeah.
Totally applicable.
To be honest, there really isn't anything that I advise for people for non-monogamy or polyamory that does not enhance a monogamous relationship. You don't have to have multiple relationships to have good communication, to have regular check-ins, to design your relationship.
We can learn a lot as a monogamous couple
Yeah.
from polyamorous. So one of the assumptions that I think I had about polyamory was that it was all of these parallel relationships going on at the same time, very separate from one another. And the sense that I got from you in our conversation earlier is that oftentimes it's really very communal, that there's a kind of integration between a lot of these partners. So I'm also curious about the kind of communication that you have, not just with the romantic partner, but with the other people involved, with the secondary partners or the partners of your partner.
Sure, yeah. So it's interesting. Polyamory looks different in different situations. And yes, sometimes it can look like parallel tracks, and sometimes it can be interconnected. In fact, the sort of the term that I use for my relationship is kitchen table poly, right? So the idea is that all my partners and their partners can, sit around the table, break bread, and connect and spend time together. That's not for everybody. That's not how every polyamorous relationships work, but there are definitely those that are like that. And in those situations, there are definitely some very interesting relationships beyond the romantic ones. So your relationship with your partner's partner, the term for that is your Metamour. People shorten it to my metas. So I think for me personally, that's one of the most fascinating relationships out there. Your relationship with your partner's partner, especially as a woman who mostly dates men who date women. The relationship is two women loving a man, and that relationship is fascinating because all the archetypes that we have out there tells us that we should be in competition, that we should be threatened by one another, that it shouldn't exist in the first place, right? It's wrong, like it should not happen. Even those situations where it's like, there's so many jokes about wives and mother-in-laws, right? All these archetypes. When they do work, personally my Metamours are, some of my best friends. And I think that relationship, if you can nurture it, if it feels right for you, if you have space for that, not everybody has space for that, right? Because it takes emotional energy, mental energy, time, effort, showing up for yet another relationship, right? It's not available for everyone, but if it is available for you, they're super interesting relationships.
Yeah. What have you learned from your Metamour relationship?
Yeah. I continue to be fascinated by them. For various reasons of my own backgrounds, I went to an all-girls boarding school for 6 years. So I had a difficult relationship with women. I really struggled to be friends with women for a long time. In my corporate job as well, I was very career-minded. I advanced really quickly, and quite quickly, the number of women in the room dwindled as I was getting higher up in the ranks, so I was spending a lot more time with men. I didn't spend time nurturing friendships with women, so I found myself kind of not doing well in just friendships with women. Surprisingly, I found healing around this topic with my Metamours. My first Metamour, my first polyamorous boyfriend's girlfriend, was incredible to me. She was kind and loving and inclusive and nurturing, really set a high bar for me of what that relationship can be like. And it was healing. I became very close with her. She became a very safe person for me. I was fascinated that this was happening. Like, this was the relationship that was going to heal my, wounds around relationships with women. I was like, wow, this is really happening here. And she set a precedence and a model for me that I could do that too. And I learned a lot about myself. And my biggest takeaway is that you don't know what you get out of these relationships. And just, if you have it in you, to make room for them. Just be curious. You don't have to commit, but just be curious of what you might be able to get out of that relationship. How you show up in those relationships as well. There's a lot to learn in there. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What about in polyamorous relationships where there are children? Because you mentioned also earlier that you have some friends in polyamorous families.
Yeah.
What has, in your experience, what happens in those relationships and in those families?
Sure.
Also for the kid, for the kids.
Yeah. So caveat, I don't have any kids. So this is mostly theoretical and anecdotal. But the reporting that's done on this, there's really one person that has been tracking this and doing research on this. It's Dr. Eli Sheff has been doing a longitudinal study for about 20 years on polyamorous families. Her book Polyamorous Next Door is the only kind of book on this out there. And her findings are that kids are thriving. They get it as long as you're providing them a stable home where they know who everybody is and they understand their parents and their parents aren't going anywhere. These auxiliary relationships, the other relationship that are coming in, that they're introduced in a way that makes sense to them and they're not sort of flying in and out and they're sort of coming in slowly, integrating and they're informed along the way. They're fine, they're thriving. They do really well and they understand and wrap their heads around it really quickly. I think they also not exposed to the stigmas and expectations of what relationships should be, right? They have multiple best friends, so they get it, especially the young ones that don't understand the sexual side of things, and they know that you can have more than one friend and you can be close to more than one people. They know that they're close to mommy and daddy, so it makes sense that mommy and daddy are close to other people,
So it sounds like this study found that sharing the polyamory structure is really important to share with the children.
Right.
To kind of have that be part of the conversation, to let them in.
Yes, for sure. Absolutely. Yeah. And personally, my sort of anecdotal experience, I have I host this event called Curious Fox Social where we have panel discussions on topics around relationships. It's for a community that challenges the status quo in love, sex, and relationships. Every month I put a panel together and we discuss various topics, and I did 2 panels on polyamory and kids, and in both of those panels I had a kid on the panel. One was 13, the other one was 15, and they blew everybody away. They were incredibly well adjusted, incredibly articulate, very emotionally intelligent, very clear with their boundaries, and knew everything about what was going on, and they were also very clear that they didn't care. They weren't thinking about it all the time. They understood that who their parents were. They understood that these people were part of their bigger family. And as long as things were stable, they were happy. And this was demonstrated. We're not just like reading a book. These kids were sitting, looking at a room, 40, 50 people, 40, 50 adults, like staring at this, these kids, just watching them. They handled themselves sometimes better than the adults that I've had on the panel.
With courageous children.
Absolutely, yeah. And so well so much talking has to happen for polyamory, right? Kids pick up on it. They were so articulate. Not only just knowing their words, but knowing how they feel. Like they knew their feeling words, and they knew the difference between I think and I feel. And they could say, when this and this happens, I feel this way. And they weren't saying, I even noticed they wouldn't say things like, and mom made me feel this way. They were owning their feelings. They knew feeling words. They knew their feeling words. It was incredible. It was inspiring.
How did they describe their relationships to their parents' partners?
It sounded like, I'm trying to think slightly differently. The 2 kids that I had differently. One was like almost like an uncle relationship, and the other one was like almost like an older brother relationship. That's what they were kind of describing it. But they clearly had their own relationship with these people. And I think one of them, the first one, was talking about how that person is no longer in a relationship with mom, but they were still spending time together. They would still play basketball. I think that was the thing they were still doing. And I think that is also important if you're in a polyamorous structure and you're bringing people into the relationship, you have to be prepared that sometimes if they get close to the kids and you split up, the kids might not want to split up.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that you might want to think about as well. So it's worth thinking about. It's not, these things aren't for everyone. And I say this, I am a big supporter of monogamy. Like if it's working for you, it's great. just for some people, it doesn't work for them. And the same with non-monogamy or polyamory. It's not for everyone. It's not the right answer for everyone. Polyamorous families with kids is not the answer for everyone. It needs to work for you. And if it does work for you and people are thriving, go ahead and do it. But don't force it, you know.
As you're talking about how kids are thriving in polyamorous relationships, I'm thinking about how our culture has had a stigma against gay people having kids and been very worried about, like, what are the outcomes going to be? And the reality is that those kids are fine and those kids are thriving. Yeah. And it seems like something similar
but it's so much more about the quality of the relationship, not the actual structure, the sexuality.
Right.
Stability of home, I guess, all they care about. Stable home. Right. They want to know that the home is going to be there when they come home, and it's going to be stable. Mom and dad are going to be there. That's all they care about. What it looks like really doesn't really affect them.
So can you tell us a little bit about the poly community in New York City?
There's a thriving one. There is a thriving community in New York City. The biggest meetup happens second Monday of every month at the Delancey on the upper floor. It's run by an organization called Open Love NY. And that's just the big one. There's hundreds of people that show up, but there are also many, many meetups that happen, events, socials, parties. Google is your friend, Facebook is your friend, meetup.com is your friend. You can find them. Also, there are certain dating apps that will allow you to pick non-monogamy. So if you're sort of online dating and looking for a community, you can look for the community through that as well. I know OkCupid does it. They actually switch really quickly. They were like, oh, okay, you want to do non-monogamous dating? We'll just put it in our search terms. So there's a thriving community. You can take the online route. I do encourage people to show up for the events because you don't necessarily only want to date either. If you want to open up your relationship, if you want to be polyamorous, community helps. Other people who are doing it helps. Because the noise around us is monogamy. The resources are for monogamy. Most of your friends, if they are monogamous, are going to give you advice one way, right? You need to change the noise around you. You need
a model.
You need models, right? You need models, you need resources. You need a community of people who are doing it in their own way. You need language. You need support. I think people often make the mistake of they decide to be in an open relationship. They want to sort of seek out polyamory and they just go out to date. You know, that's the first thing they do. They just want to find a partner. My recommendation is find a community first and see what it's like. And then from there, you can date within the community or with the community around you. You can date outside the community. But as a part of the opening up process, before you start dating, find the community, find a community, and make friends. From there, start dating would be my advice.
That makes so much sense. You know, I don't know exactly what the stats are, but I have this sense that polyamory, open relationships, non-monogamy just seems to be increasingly more popular. That we hear about it more in mainstream media, that these communities seem to be building. What kind of sense do you have about why this is happening now and why this is becoming more people are drawn to this?
I think they're just becoming more visible. I think they've been around for a very, very, very long time. I don't think this is a new phenomenon. I think polyamorous people being around for a long time. I think it's becoming more visible because I feel like it's the next wave, right? We've legalized gay marriage. That's kind of like, okay, so relationships don't have to come in one size. And then I think the next step is like, what else? I also think that it is in line with the feminist movement. I think that as women don't need to look for a man to have a status, safety, security in the world, then the dyad is not the defining structure, right? I think that has a massive impact. As women are earning more independent, owning their sexuality, as all those things are happening, they're sort of looking at their relationships more pragmatically. Right? They don't necessarily need to be in a couple to get the things they want, right? So I think that has an effect on it. And I think we now also in modern love, we look for relationships, look look for more from relationships, and it's not all there, right? So we go, well, before we would go, okay, well, it's not all there, I'll make do. But now we're like, well, why? Why would I make do? I don't make do with anything else in my life, right? Everything is my cell phone is customized. I can make anything exactly how I want it. I can have things delivered to my house. I can, why not have the relationship that way too? Yeah. And
one assumption that I think I previously had, but I know many people have, is that men are the ones who initiate open relationships, polyamory. But in fact, it's equal, and a lot of women initiate open relationships.
Yeah, I think often that is a assumption that happens. I think because we think often open relationships, we immediately think it's about sex. Most of the time, it is about sex. Right? Let's not be coy about it, right? Yes, it is about relationships, but what the big difference is, you're now opening yourself up to more sexual partners. Not always, but it's there. And then we make the next assumption that women aren't sexual, right? That women don't want sex is like the narrative that we believe. Very untrue. That's just not true, right? And I think that's why people think, oh, women don't want sex, so therefore they wouldn't be the one that would initiate an open relationship. Women absolutely want sex, and they like variety as much as men do.
If not more,
exactly. And
search for novelty.
Right.
Yeah. For sure, exactly. And they're feeling more secure in their lives. So they are coming out there and saying, I want more. I want more, I want different, I want to explore. And it's not always, I want somebody else, I don't want you, or I want somebody else, but like, let's explore together. So it's not, the request isn't always, I want an open relationship, I want to go and date other people. It's like, let's do this thing together. Let's see what else is out there. Let's, see if we can date somebody together, if we can date as a couple, can we go to a sex party? Can we explore together? Can we look at our sexuality and see what else is out there? So I think it's pretty equal.
And hidden polyamory or hidden open relationships are happening all the time if you want to think about affairs, right?
Oh, for sure.
This is all having relationships with multiple people where it's in the open and it's being honest.
Like your experience, that what you were talking about, having a lot of infidelity in your relationships,
right, exactly.
And feeling like there was something wrong with you, and now just changing the label, changing the structure, changing the communication, it's a whole other way of thinking about it.
Right, exactly. I didn't want to lie.
Yeah.
I just didn't want to lie. So I just made sure that I was in a relationship that I didn't have to lie, and suddenly things are better,
It makes sense that there are so many people who are interested in polyamory and open relationships.
And interestingly, when you're talking about men versus women, I've read things about affairs. We have this assumption that more men have affairs than women, and actually it's more even. And when they started looking at the statistics of affairs in different areas of the country, they found that actually that women who have higher salaries are more likely to have affairs.
That makes sense,
and
right?
that's exactly what you were speaking to, right? When you have stability, when you're not so dependent on your partner.
Right, for sure, exactly. And I think more and more, this is also in line with the sex positive culture. Sex positivity is also becoming something that's out there. Women are owning their sexuality, owning being slutty, and not accepting the stigma that comes from it. And I think that also helps.
Yeah, I've worked with a lot of clients and known a lot of people who have opened up their relationship and find that jealousy becomes a really big issue. Or even before they open up, are worried that if they do open up, that jealousy will tear their relationship apart. And so how do you coach couples? How do you coach individuals who are trying to really manage these feelings that so many people have such an aversion to?
For sure, yeah. Jealousy is real. It's a feeling. It's a part of the human portfolio of feelings, and it absolutely comes up. It's in fact probably in the top 3 questions, if not the first question I get asked if I ever talk about polyamory with anyone. And I think there are a couple of things to bear in mind. Just like any other emotion, some of us have a disposition for jealousy, right? Some people are happy people, some people are angry people, some people are organized people, some people are jealous people as a disposition. And if that's you, there's nothing wrong with that. Non-monogamy might not be the right design for you. Just saying it. And then there's other type of jealousy, which is what I call situational jealousy, which is you're not necessarily a jealous person, But there's certain situations happen and you get this like wave of jealousy, and that's just very human. It's human. It's like part of the human evolution. It's like it serves a purpose. It exists for a reason. The important thing is not to make it into the green-eyed monster, right? We just make it into this like scary thing that is ultimately going to tear you and your relationship apart. It doesn't have to be. Just like sadness doesn't mean that you're never going to stop crying, or that if you're angry, you're going to go around punching walls. It's like you're just work with that emotion and try to, first of all, let it come through and understand why it's coming up. Often I find people feel jealous because they feel that there's a need not being met, or they feel left out or left behind, right? And it's important to figure out what's causing it. The way I always think about jealousy is it's like an alarm bell that goes off in your house. Like if you imagine if a fire alarm went off in your house, like it's obnoxious and loud. Most of us see these like parodies of people like trying to knock it off the wall right when it's going off. And then what you would do is you'd go, oh, there's an alarm going off, turn it off and figure out what set it off, right? Jealousy is very similar. An alarm goes off, something is wrong, something is wrong, something is wrong. Try to turn it off, because like when it's going off, it's very hard to do anything. Just like a fire alarm, they're loud and obnoxious. You can't think straight, right? Same with jealousy. When it's going off, you can't think straight. And there are multiple ways of doing that. I like the somatic method of just sitting down, breathing, taking like 10 deep breaths and locating the feeling in your body. By the time you've been through that, the emotion has come through and you've sort of calmed down, the alarm is turned off. And then do some thinking. Sometimes there's a very legitimate reason why it's coming up. Something is wrong. Like your partner hasn't paid attention to you for a while, or you feel disconnected, or there's some being transgressions happened. Something has happened, and it's just you feel jealous. Just like somebody dies and you feel sad. That's just the reaction that you have, right? If that is the case, you address what's going on with the person or with the situation. Or if it's an internal thing, if it's an insecurity, you address the insecurity. If it's a matter of feeling left out or left behind, you address that in a tactical way. So you make more dates, you set some time up for reconnection, or whatever it is, you address the underlying cause of jealousy. Because jealousy on its own it's just an alarm bell. It's not really telling you anything other than just alerting you to something being wrong.
So I'm curious, how do you negotiate time in your relationship?
Yeah.
Because I imagine that, like, if there's less time spent with a particular partner, that can activate a lot of jealousy, potentially, situational jealousy.
Yeah. People say the inside joke is that the hardest thing about polyamory is not jealousy, it's scheduling, and it's because you have to manage time, and often. I say this about myself. I have endless space for love and people in my heart. I just don't have the time in my schedule, And there's a couple of things that I get people to understand, like just reframing this. The problem that we have with love is that it is a feeling that exists in your internal universe. And your internal universe is boundless and endless and ever growing, right? And then we have this idea of you love something. We've developed this idea of like you love something more than something else, right? Because language-wise, we have a feeling, we have one word for it. We say love, right? We love ice cream, our partners, our parents, and some of us God, using the same word, right? If you look at the ancient languages, if you look at Latin, there are different words for love, applying to different ways of you expressing your love, right? The problem is, in most of the languages, modern languages, and in English, we use one word. So we love ice cream, parents, partner, God. I say God because there's a different in Latin, there's a different word for spiritual love, right? With one word. So because we're stuck, we now start saying things like, I love something more than something else. Whereas it's just one feeling that's happening inside you. There's no quantity to it. But because the language fails us, we say we love something more than something else. And then in order to manifest that, we try to map it onto something, right? To then quantify that. I love this more than that. So the thing that the thing that people map it onto is time, because it's something we know how to measure. So once you map feeling of love, which isn't quantifiable, to try to quantify it onto time, then you're looking at how much do you love somebody through the amount of time you spend with them. That's where it starts to fail. So if you can get people to understand that what you're doing is just a false mapping, and that to look at the quality of the relationship and look at and use the language of needs and feelings and what are thriving, what does that look like, and move away from how many hours a week we spend with one another, then you can have a much more of an accurate gauge of the health of the relationship and love that you feel and receive from the other person. If you're just mapping it onto time, it's not a good gauge. Having said this, for some people, quality time is a love language, right? Then it's like you do need those slots in your calendar where you're doing fun things. But it's not a way to sort of look at your overall relationship through this map of time. It's just not accurate.
Right.
So this starts to answer my next question, which is when you have a kind of primary partner, a primary couple, and one partner has found someone else, and the other partner maybe is looking or maybe isn't looking but doesn't have anyone. Like, what kind of advice do you give for that partner who doesn't have anyone else and is sitting at home and their primary partner is out on a date and they're dealing with feelings of jealousy or wishfulness, and it's really hard for them?
Get a hobby. Seriously, get a hobby. And that hobby can be self-care. Work on your self-care game. Read some books, do some meditation, get a hobby. And also, friendships are relationships. Invest in your friendships. We think of this like romantic relationship, our partner, we get so focused. And society does that. So we are, because this is one model. But invest in your friendships, get a hobby, volunteer, do something good with that time rather than sitting around twiddling your thumb, twiddling your fingers, tapping your fingers, like feeling sorry for yourself. If your partner's out and you have nothing to do something with that time. Mentor somebody, volunteer, pick up a hobby, focus on self-care, do something productive with that time. And it's a gift of time. I mean, I normally think I like my me time, like alone time, but I think of it as like a gift of time, So that would be my advice.
Don't sit around focusing on your partner. Do something for yourself.
Or for others. Sometimes that helps. I tell people like volunteering and mentoring is actually, you get a lot of satisfaction out of that, and you feel, because sometimes what's happening is it's directly affecting your self-worth. You're thinking, why don't I have somebody? Why don't I get on a date? Am I not good enough? I'm not good enough for my partner. I'm not good enough for anybody else, right? Sometimes that's the spaces that you go to. And then if you then do something to work on that, and I find the best way to work on that is to do something for somebody else, and I think that really helps.
And I imagine if you act on that feeling, that anxious feeling or that I'm not good enough feeling, you may end up going out and meeting somebody, but not being in something that you actually want to be in. It's just because, I have to fill this time with somebody else because my partner is with somebody else, but it's not fulfilling in any way. Right,
exactly. This tit for tat some people do that I also really advise against. People will say like, well, they're dating, so I must date. And they just end up dating anybody. And it's just like, you're wasting your time. You're wasting the other person's time. You're wasting your time. If you have that time available to you, do something productive. And my also like side advice for that is, if you're getting the right hobby, doing things like this, you're probably going to meet people to date anyway. So like sitting at home, anxious, worrying that nobody loves you or worrying that your partner is doing something else is... you're not going to meet anybody. Use that time to actually like do some fun stuff to meet people.
And go to the Delancey.
Exactly. On the second Monday of the month.
So you've shared a lot of wisdom with us today. I'm just curious if you have any final advice for people who are interested in opening up their relationship.
Go slow and just come to it from a place of curiosity, not from a place of we're doing this. Take each step slowly and with a curious mind, and realize that whatever you're doing doesn't have to reflect on the entire relationship. So if you want to go on a date and see what it feels like and do it in a curious way, rather than it being a definitive thing that you're doing. And then when you come home, when you're discussing things, look at it as an exploration. Remain curious, especially if you're feeling defensive, if you're feeling disconnected. Curiosity is a really good antidote for that. And master communication skills. Read books, take some workshops. There are a bunch of them on YouTube. You don't even have to pay for them. Communication is a skill, just like any skill. There are ways of learning it, and there are ways of mastering it, and there are ways of practicing it. Get to a ninja level communication.
And how can people contact you if they want to find your coaching or your workshops and your podcast as well, right?
Yes,
you just started a podcast.
Exactly. Yeah. No. Yes, we've just started that from the beginning of this year. It's very exciting. So you can find me at effyblue.com, EFFY, blue like the sky.com. If you're interested, there's actually, you can book a 20-minute call from me directly from my website. We can have that initial conversation. I also host a community organization called Curious Fox. The website is wearecuriousfoxes.com. You can also find us on Facebook, on Instagram, and the podcast as well. Wherever you listen to your podcast is now there.
What's the podcast called?
Curious Fox Podcast.
Okay.
And the Curious Fox events are for people who are curious. I put a panel together every month. We pick a topic. We explore 3 personal stories. You'll meet like-minded people. We say no promises, no pressure, no commitments, just curiosity. Just because you're turning up there doesn't mean you are taking a step towards anything other than being curious. If you're having those conversations with your partner or thinking about having those conversations, I really recommend you show up to one of the events. You'll find many other people in the same boat as you, and you'll meet some people who've been doing it for a while and are willing to share their experiences with you.
So exciting. It sounds like a great resource.
Yeah, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.